guys, welcome back to this channel. In today's video, we're going to be looking at Othello context. So this will include Jacobean views of race and gender, femininity and masculinity, as well as important context about status and hierarchy, as well as religion and Shakespeare's own individual interests and loyalties and experiences that may have influenced his work. Let's get into it.
Hi and welcome to this video on Othello context in order to talk you through the different elements of context that are important to understanding Othello and building analysis that is formed in an understanding of Shakespeare, his work, his audience, and his time, and why he would present Othello and the other characters the way he does, and why the sympathy for certain characters is what it is. So if we first think about what does context include? Well, it firstly includes the writer's biography and life, and experiences. So we have to cover something about Shakespeare, not necessarily irrelevant details like for the fact that his father was a glove maker, but certainly something like his grammar school education is important contextually because that is how he had exposure to the Greek tragedies and the form of Greek tragedy on which Othello is based, as well as plays with the conventions of, as well as thinking about his exposure to Italy and Italian literature, not necessarily going to the country himself, but certainly either being able to read or being aware of Italian literature because his source material was Italian, from Cinthio's version of this story, which was a short story called Desdemona and the Moor. With this as well, we want to think about the writer's inspiration. We want to think about the time period, which of course is Jacobean England, and the zeitgeist of Jacobean England. So what was happening in Jacobean England that might have influenced Shakespeare's presentation of Othello and the other characters and this Italian story. With this as well, we want to think about ideas of gender and of race, which certainly as well influence the presentation and key themes of the play as well, and are certainly different from our conception as a modern audience. And we also want to think about the setting, the fact that he chose Venice as the setting of the play, as well as Cyprus, and what the duality of these two settings would mean to a contemporary audience is crucial. So these are some of the places we're going to take a look at. So firstly here, thinking about Shakespeare's own background, and of course, as students in the UK and in lots of countries around the world study Shakespeare continuously through their education, it's likely that you know something about Shakespeare and his upbringing, but these are the relevant contextual details for Othello itself. So for example, the fact that Shakespeare wrote Othello as part of his very productive tragic period between 1601 and 1609, in which most of his greatest tragedies were produced, including Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. In addition to this, we also think about Shakespeare's classical education, including the study of Latin, Italian, and Greek, as important to understanding Othello, because, as I said, for Othello as well as for several other of Shakespeare's plays, particularly those set in Venice, he drew from the work of Italian writers, including, in this case, Giraldi Cinthio's Gli Hecatomithi, which was published in 1565 in Italian. And this was the source material not only for Othello, but also for the comedy Measure for Measure, which he wrote, it's believed, around the same time, that were both based on the general concept of Cinthio's version of this story. But of course, one is a tragedy and one is a comedy. So thinking about the ways in which this basic story could be formed in two different ideas and in two different plot structures and genres. With this as well, we have to think about Shakespeare's writing as tempered and influenced and perhaps even guided by the influence of King James I's patronage. So King James I was a patron of Shakespeare's plays and is known to have attended at least a few of them in person at the Globe Theatre or for private performances, for example, at Whitehall. And that's the reason that Shakespeare's theatre troupe was renamed from the Lord Chamberlain's Men to the King's Men as homage to King James's sponsorship. So it's likely that King James's paying and support of this troupe had either a direct or indirect influence on the content and tone of Shakespeare's play. For example, this is very obvious in Macbeth, the Scottish play, in which it's seen to legitimise, validate and support King James's claim to the throne and his monarchy over both England and Scotland, and to legitimise it in the eyes of the English and Scottish. With this as well, perhaps Shakespeare included themes that would have been relevant or interesting to King James's own interests or to events of the time, including King James's interest in witchcraft and the focus on the fear of otherness that was perhaps stoked by political conflicts with the Ottoman Empire in King James's early reign, as well as the late Queen Elizabeth I's reign, as well as with Spain. So perhaps these are references in order to pique the interest of King James, as well as to capture the energy of the early 1600s and the beginning of King James's reign. And perhaps as well, King James's patronage did have another effect in Shakespeare's writing, in that Shakespeare had to mask and carefully craft any critique of leadership, of rule, or of politics as one that did not too overtly attack or criticize King James's rule and thus be treated as anti-king or anti-monarch material. As a result of this meant that a lot of Shakespeare's tragedies and a lot of Shakespeare's political work is set in places that are not England. So, for example, one of the reasons why Othello perhaps is set in Venice and in Cyprus as opposed to in England and Spain, to show that this could not be something that happened in England. The people, the behaviour and the leadership would not be confused with that of England at the time. With this as well, this follows a trend of contemporary events that included the publication of literature and plays about Moorish characters, or characters who were Moors, who were black people from Spain, who were also Muslim. Again, and perhaps another reference to this mighty other, the Ottoman Empire, who was a powerful political opponent to England at the time, and its sort of oppositional force to England in the English mindset was one of which it was of perhaps equal power, but very different values in the mind of English people. So perhaps this kind of equal opposite to them. But also this time of more established trade at the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, and resultingly a slightly more racially diverse society, or exposure to more diversity in the concept and understanding of race at the time, but still obviously complex relationships and tensions regarding race, religion and social status. Again, crafting this as a play set in Italy, where famously was a centre of Catholicism as opposed to Protestantism, gave the English audience an opportunity to distance themselves from what they would have seen as the heretical or outlandish or even blasphemous behaviour, or perhaps immoral behaviour of Catholics who they would have been set against politically. as a result of the Protestant Reformation and the Tudor monarchy through the different generations. With this as well, Shakespeare wrote during times of great censorship. So in 1599, there was a bishop's ban on all scurrilous, seditious and religious or political themes in plays, making all of these illegal within the confines of the City of London at the time. Perhaps why Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was built on the south side of the river, which was not technically the City of London at the time. And perhaps again, a reason why Shakespeare couched his political commentary within a foreign context, so as to avoid the harsh punishment that would follow a breach of these laws. They're not talking about, to the mind, the mind of the audience, about England, but rather as this about this other country that is, quote unquote, exoticized and othered in the mind of the audience. And just to pull together Othello with some of the other tragedies in Shakespeare's arsenal, thinking about the major themes that reflect across these different tragedies and thus are part of Shakespeare's tragic work. So betrayal, particularly by closest friends, appearance versus reality, deception and self-deception, and also the appearance of deception. So these different layers of understanding, misunderstanding, seeing and being confused as to what you're seeing is real or not being able to trust one's instincts. Indecision with this as well, and destabilization. Disillusionment, particularly of the great truths of life, trust, love, family, and faith. Mistrust as well, particularly this idea of double betrayal of the best friend with the wife or love of the person. So the double betrayal being the person you love most betraying you with the other person you love most, and thus making you much, much more isolated in terms of not being able to trust anyone around you. Doubt as well, whether that's self-doubt, doubt of what appears to be the truth, doubt of one's former convictions, or doubt of the world around them, as well as inner conflict over external pressure. So these ideas, particularly of these greatest tragedies, being one of this external pressure then becoming internalized and driving to this inner conflict in which indecision, mistrust and self-deception do bring the tragic hero to their ultimate downfall. If we think about what inspired Shakespeare's Othello, we've got a couple of different places to look. Firstly, as I've mentioned, Giraldi Cinthio's collection of 100 tales written in Italian, which Shakespeare might have read in the original Italian or in the French translation that came out slightly later. Cinthio's version is known as Desdemona and the Moor, or the Moorish captain in some sources. The Othello character remains unnamed throughout Cinthio's version, as well as Iago. It's much more a focus on Desdemona and her transgressive behavior in marrying the Moor and the consequences of that decision and defiance. And even from then, Cinthio is believed to have borrowed from the Decameron by Boccaccio or from a Byzantine epic from even further back. It also contains significant similarities to the story The Three Apples from 1001 Nights, and the tragic conventions of Greek playwrights Sophocles and Euripides and the writer Plutarch, whose text parallel lives inspired several of Shakespeare's plays, including Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. So it's clear that he had a firm exposure and grounding in both Greek and Roman plays, texts, and history. Also, he was influenced by Roman playwrights such as Seneca and Ovid, whose work focused on the themes of love and transformation, which is very common both in Shakespeare's comedies and tragedies, but particularly in tragedies, thinking about different layers of love, a more complex and changing and disturbances to the presentation of love than in the comedies. We also want to think about the Jacobean era and the zeitgeist, or the mainstream culture of the time, and what it was influenced by. And the Jacobean era spans from the period of King James's rule, from 1603 to 1625. Now, Othello was written, it's believed, in 1604, so very much at the start of King James's rule, and perhaps capturing that period of transition and instability between the end of Queen Elizabeth's rule and King James's coronation and early reign. Now, some of these bullet points, or all of these bullet points, would have influenced Shakespeare's own experience and life, and perhaps formed part of his presentation of the characters in Othello as well as his other plays. For example, the rigidly hierarchical society determined by the great chain of being, this structure of society in which everyone's position is absolutely set in stone and determined by God, and any challenge to it is considered a transgression. Within this society, a black man becoming a general from believed to be a slave originally, and marrying the elite, marrying not only the elite but into the elite in Venetian society, is quite the move to make in terms of changing one's situation. Not to say that this in itself, in Othello's case, is transgressive, but certainly the audience might have been aware of this change in his fortune and his position in society, and been not extremely receptive to it. Same with this, a tightly controlled patriarchal society in which gender expectations determine women's position in society as submissive, subservient, and their role being entirely wrapped up into wives and mothers and their fulfillment of those expectations. Also, this was a prejudiced society, suspicious of outsiders, not only of people who are not Protestant or people who were not white, but any kind of difference was rejected in society. And these common enemies to England included witches, with these fears and anxieties around witchcraft stoked by King James's own writings in demonology, for example, the text that he wrote that's often cited when students are looking at Macbeth. The same with the Spanish as a continuous enemy and antagonist to England during the reign of Elizabeth I and James I, as they sort of battled for who would be the more world-dominant empire. With this as well, the Moors were few in England at the time, but there were 2 edicts from Elizabeth I that have since been questioned in terms of their validity and their effect across England, but they were supposedly published in 1599 and 1601, exiling Moors from England. This was in a culture in which people, again, were suspicious of outsiders, and people feared that Moors coming to England from Spain or coming to England from Northern Africa would displace or take the jobs and positions of English people and change the fabric of English society. This much less stigmatized and much more accepted in a very cosmopolitan, diverse trade place such as Venice, that was very commonly diverse. The Spanish Empire, as I said, and threats of Spanish domination, that was punctuated by the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English in 1588, but absolutely was still resonant in the English memory, and tensions continued throughout James I's reign. There were questions about leadership, not only during Elizabeth I's reign, but particularly towards her final years and in the transition into King James I's reign. Notably, she didn't ever name an heir out of fear of retribution or being deposed by one of these supposed heirs during her lifetime. And many challenged King James I's rule. This was one of the reasons for example, the Gunpowder Plot and other anti-monarchy protests, riots, and schemes across James's early reign. There was also religious turmoil Previously, as James' mother was a Catholic, Mary, Queen of Scots, there was hope from the Catholics still in England that there would be a relief for the Catholics in England. They'd be able to practice with less restriction, but this was not the case. And in matter of fact, there was an intensifying of anti-Catholic sentiment across James I's rule. There were warring factions trying to retain power in James's cabinet and favour, as well as in Elizabeth I. There were conspiracies against both of them regarding the right to rule and worship. There was also the transatlantic slave trade. So since the 1560s, English traders had been engaging in the slave trade. Whether or not that was state sanctioned or not is up for debate. But Queen Elizabeth I founded the Barbary Company during her reign, and that legitimised also Anglo-Ottoman trade, which was often in terms of people and enslaved people being exchanged in that dynamic. As well as this, the Age of Discovery, in which European explorers set new limits and new boundaries on the British Empire and claimed more land for England and as well as other European countries across the world. And again, there was this new concept of global domination. With this, there was this era of the explorers being these glamorous figures who returned with these fantastical descriptions of what they had encountered on their travels that often stoked prejudice as well as fears of outsiders, and also developed very confused or mythicized depictions of people outside of England. Within England, there were also concepts of gender that did influence the society at the time. For women in Jacobean England, there was very little agency. Their lives were determined by their fathers and later their husbands. Marriages would be arranged by a father, and the match would prioritize the power, wealth, or influence gained by both parties here. So both families, and particularly both men, the father and the soon-to-be husband, rather than romance between the couple. So then women became viewed as transactional, and particularly their virginity as transactional, because it was an exchange that for a dowry would be received the ability to have legitimate upper-class children in the case of the nobles and the elite in society, to which Desdemona belongs as our wife and daughter in Othello. Marriage was the only way that women gained agency, because married women had more freedoms and status than single women. However, this was mostly confined to specific feminine spheres of influence like the home. So when we see female characters interacting or responding to men more clearly or more overtly, this is behind closed doors, and particularly within domestic spaces, and sororal bonds, so sisterly bonds, particularly between Desdemona and Emilia, are developed within the even closer confines of Desdemona's bedroom and Desdemona's chambers. And it's here too that Othello and Desdemona are most honest with each other, and the final confrontation occurs. These anxieties around their marriage really do centre finally in their marital bedroom. Marriage made a woman the property of her husband. Women were considered the weaker sex who needed physical and moral protection from their husbands. This stemmed from biblical beliefs and the fall of Eve. The husband was considered head of house and had to provide for wife and children, and the husband was responsible for a wife's behaviour. So if a wife was failing in some way, it was the husband's responsibility to chastise her, to correct her, and to give her a guide towards correct moral behaviour. And it's been described in conduct books of the time that the relationship was meant to be more almost like father and daughter in terms of the power dynamic, as well as the knowledge and instruction and protection that a husband was meant to offer for wife. With this as well, we want to think about the Madonna-whore dichotomy, which is this idea of women being perceived as one of two distinct archetypes. The Madonna, or a pure, virtuous, innocent, Mary-like caregiver, so like the Virgin Mary, or a whore, a sexualized, seductive, and corrupting woman like Eve, who brings about, in Eve's case, the downfall of humanity and the downfall of man. Critics use this term to describe the duality of femininity, that women can either be this perfect, idealized, but passive and two-dimensional character in the Madonna, or they can be this blamed and villainized, corrupting influence, but active, seemingly. This is a concept used particularly with a feminist lens, because it's suggesting that these fantasies of men don't allow for the complexities or agency of women at all, because it forces them to embody only one or the other. And whenever they defy the expectations of a Madonna figure, they are then classified and reduced to the whore figure who deserves punishment and should be exiled from society. And Jacobeans also believed in the pseudoscience of physiognomy, so a belief that a person's external appearance was determined by and reflective of their moral character. So when a woman was looked at, her beauty, for example, was always linked to purity. Her pale skin, her clear forehead, her blue eyes, in particular, if we're thinking about the very slim and Eurocentric beauty standards for Shakespeare's audience. And part of the anxieties in Othello is that Othello, looking at Desdemona, says she looks honest. She seems honest, the way that Cassio does as well in that quote. But his concern is that somehow she's managed to mask this villainy underneath and deception with a pure and innocent facade. Then we want to think about the other hand here with men in Jacobean England. And the most important thing to consider with masculinity in Jacobean England was reputation. Women helped to define this reputation because a man's reputation was defined by his control over and the behavior of his wife and daughters. So there was an obsession with women's chastity that engendered anxiety and violence towards them because their behavior, women's behavior, reflected on their husband's or father's control of their household. Thus, Brabantio's reaction to Desdemona's betrayal of him. Masculine spheres of influence were public, so the battlefield, the courtroom, and the public sphere. So when Othello is performing and speaking in front of a crowd, he is absolutely in his element and is considered this complete embodiment of masculinity. And it's Emilia and Desdemona's presence in these places that starts this uncertainty and starts to build this foreshadowing that something is going to go wrong here with this presentation of gender. With this as well, we need to consider cuckoldry. So cuckold describes a wife's infidelity towards her husband. Her husband was the cuckold. And the image is one of a man with antlers or deer's horns that was popular on Jacobean stages. It was this kind of clownish figure, this fool character. And there are many different reasons why people think that it's particularly horns that is associated with cuckoldry, but one is that a horned creature cannot see their own horns, just as a cuckolded man can't see his wife's infidelities, even if everyone else can. And so men were very distrustful of women's ability to control themselves as the weaker sex, as women. It was Eve who gave in to Satan's temptation, and thus it was women who were the weaker and more corruptible of the two genders in a Jacobean mindset. So it was men's responsibility to keep an absolute tight control over their women to ensure that cuckoldry, or even the suggestion of it, was not possible for them, because it would be fundamentally damaging. And some critics describe it as worse than a homicide. Worse than murder would be to a man's reputation would be cuckoldry, because it suggests that they are not a man and not at all encompassing what a man is expected to be and do. And even the suggestion of cuckoldry justified violence and punishment towards women, or even casting off the woman entirely as a deceiver or as a betrayer. Then we want to think about race in Jacobean England. Now, firstly, the views of race in Elizabethan and Jacobean England were complex. Anxieties developed by racial presentations in the Bible led people to associate blackness with devilry and evil. So there were very common presentations and depictions of devils as associated with blackness, painted black in art of the time, in religious art and figures at the time, particularly so that it would juxtapose with the white, gold light associated with God and the Holy Spirit and Jesus. It was also believed, as I said, that Queen Elizabeth I signed 2 edicts expelling Moors from England, very similar to that done in Spain, in response to fears that Moors coming to England would displace English people in terms of jobs. However, this has been challenged by scholarship, especially because Elizabeth I's own house was believed to have several black servants, including John Blank, who was believed to be a trumpeter during Tudor times. There are also tracts that describe her household as having black servants, particularly young children servants. And there was also the fact that the Queen entertained diplomats from Morocco as part of easing tensions between England and the Ottoman Empire. In 1600, it was part of an ambassadorial visit from the Ottoman Empire. And so these edicts then have been challenged. But despite this, the stereotypes and prejudice of Black and African people spread in England, fueled by accounts of travellers and explorers who came back and described people as fundamentally different from English people's behaviours, religious practices, beliefs, and even humanity. And of course, this was also fueled by biblical teachings, particularly those of Noah's son, so Noah of Noah's Ark, Noah's son Ham, who was believed to be the ancestor of all African people, who was dark or black-skinned, and who had committed the terrible sin of violating his father's privacy and had been condemned to eternal punishment associated with hard labor and rejection by Noah. Now, again, this has been challenged more recently, as some scholars believe that contemporary people thought that this was associated more with working class people than it was with people of a different race, but both were common ideas at the time, depending on which scholarship you read. And certainly explorers of the time cited son of Noah or Ham as descriptors for talking about people from Africa and from other continents. This also is another element here when we talk about miscegenation. Now, miscegenation is the interracial marriages, particularly between Black and white people, and that includes sexual relationships between them. Because at the time, sex was viewed as a process for reproduction as well as a sacrament with God, the concept of mixed-race children were often viewed as a type of quote-unquote corruption of the white race. Obviously, an extremely prejudiced and racist viewpoint, but one that Shakespeare's audience likely believed. And so mixed-race children consequently occupied a third space, as shown in the quotation below by David Olusoga in Black and British. And he describes that the devil was depicted as black and innumerable, medieval paintings and continue to be portrayed as such in Elizabethan and Stuart woodcuts. To call someone black in Shakespeare's England was to insult them, not by any linkage with race, but because the colour itself was pregnant with negative symbolism. Whiteness, by contrast, was the marker of purity, virginity, and even divinity, concepts that were never more loaded with meaning than in the years during which a virgin queen, Queen Elizabeth I, who whitened her skin with lead-based makeup, ruled England. Were Africans imbued with the negative traits associated with the colour black? So that's the question there. They didn't think necessarily of race as a genetic idea, but did question this idea of the blackness of people of colour, wondering if it was congenital, inherited, temporary, permanent, or reflective of their morality or humanity, and wondered whether children born to interracial couples would be black children, white children, or, as Olusoga quotes, some other hue here. So this more broadly then suggests, as Olusoga also confirms, that race didn't mean to Shakespeare and to Jacobeans what it means to us in terms of inherited traits that define different racial categories, but for much more broadly is a social construct, right? For the Elizabethans and Jacobeans, whiteness and blackness were much more associated with notions of purity and pedigree. So it was much more associated with the biblical connotations of Ham, as well as morality, influenced by physiognomy and influenced by these presentations of whiteness and blackness interacting as racialized opposites. And so when we think about Othello, who is black, and the reception of him and his marriage to Desdemona by the other characters, we see all of these contemporary stereotypes presented on stage, but through characters like Brabantio and Iago, who are not sympathetic characters for the most part. So then perhaps Shakespeare is leading us to interrogate, and even his contemporary audience to interrogate their own prejudiced view of blackness and to question their own stereotyping, not necessarily only on racial lines, but also in terms of prejudice more broadly and appearance of people versus their character. And part of the tragedy that Lewis describes is that Iago's evil here is actually that he leads Othello to come to see himself as his own stereotype. So here we have an Othello at the beginning who is very much subverting the presentation of black people that Jacobeans would have expected at the time. He is noble, he is the embodiment of masculinity, he's brave, he is upper class, he is rich and powerful in Venice, he's married to Desdemona in a loving relationship, and drives him to become what the contemporary audience would have expected him to be from the start, which is this monstrous character who is violent and judgmental and insecure and indecisive and difficult as a character by the end to believe and in some cases to sympathize with. But this then means that Shakespeare is perhaps upending contemporary views of race here, because he is then forcing us to, and his audience who would have resisted, to accept that Othello is this highborn character who is different from that presentation, and the real tragedy is that he is brought to become a stereotype, and the stereotypes which otherwise would have gone unquestioned by Shakespeare's audience. We also want to think with this play about the setting of Othello, and there are two major settings: Venice, which is this diverse and sophisticated seat of Mediterranean trade. Even though it's not England, it is meant to be a kind of fantastical England, and then Cyprus, which at the time was the epicenter of the Ottoman Empire. It was this strange and othered enemy. It wasn't Christian, but rather Muslim. It wasn't under English control, but rather Ottoman control. And it's an isolated, distant military outpost that was believed to be almost akin to the end of the world. So in another place, very much like forests, very much like moors in Shakespeare's plays, a place where humans become something other than themselves, where social disorder and barbarism reign, and where people act differently. And these two settings were entangled politically and economically during Shakespeare's life because Cyprus and Venice were major trading rivals, and the Ottoman Empire had wrested control of Cyprus from Venice. Venice had control previously of Cyprus in battles between 1570 and 1573, and maintained control of it even after Cyprus's, or the Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Lepanto. And England maneuvered between these two competitors in order to continue benefiting from the more powerful trader at the time during both Elizabeth I and James I's reign. But stereotypes and prejudice continued for places like Cyprus and who would be there and how people would behave there. That could be described as Edward Said has coined as Orientalism. And the definition of Orientalism, it's a term coined and popularized by anthropologist Edward Said in his 1978 text of the same name, Orientalism, to describe how Western writers and cultures have historically represented countries in the Middle East and Asia. So Said describes this representation as built on stereotypes that center on the East as the contrasting other to the supposedly civilized, rational, modern, and Christian West. So in other words, Europe, particularly Western Europe, defines all other cultures, particularly cultures to the east of them, as the other to what they are. So if England, for example, is civilized, the East, which would be in this case Cyprus, is uncivilized. If England is rational, Cyprus is irrational, and irrational things happen there. Same with modern, Cyprus is then antiquated or unevolved. And if England is Christian, particularly Protestant, then Cyprus is this kind of barbaric or pagan or hedonistic place. And Said describes that for Europe, quote unquote, Islam was a lasting trauma. And until the end of the 17th century, this constant fear of Ottoman domination was persistent in not only in England, but in Europe. And it represented for all of Christian Europe, and I'm quoting again, a constant danger, and in time, European civilization incorporated that peril and its law, its great events, figures, virtues, and vices as something woven into the fabric of life, which means that Europe continued to distinguish itself and Ottoman Empire, as well as kind of a homogeneous view of the East otherwise, as fundamentally antithetical to whatever it was and decided that England was. So again, quoting Said, Europe is powerful and articulate, Asia is defeated and distant. So it's this idea of a motif, as Said describes, of danger from an external force, which in this case is presented in Cyprus by this enemy force who is defeated by Othello's army. So then finally, why Othello and why in 1604? It was first performed at Whitehall, suggested perhaps as part of wedding celebrations for James's daughter, because it took place roughly the same time as Julius Caesar. The zeitgeist again was defined by contention with the Spanish Empire, the Age of Discovery, the presence of Moors in England, contemporary anxieties about Islam and the power of 16th century Ottoman Empire, anxieties around witchcraft and devilry, punctuated by James's text Demonology, which was published initially in 1597 and then again once he took the throne in a revised form in 1603. A cult of personality surrounding the Virgin Queen, centering on ideals of virginity, purity, and pedigree, so thus women of the time being expected to fulfill those expectations as well, and this central image of England being fixated on whiteness, purity, and virginity. So very much the way that Desdemona is crafted sounds very similar to this. And then increasing dissatisfaction with James I's leadership after a retrospective golden era of Elizabeth I's reign, which of course was not without its troubles, but particularly in those early years of James, a very tumultuous beginning to quite a difficult reign, so perhaps capturing a little bit of the constant military presence and turmoil both in Venice and in Cyprus across the pages and text of Othello. This gives you, I hope, an introduction to the context of Othello and will set you up well to think about how to apply this context in your own writing, as we see across these resources more links between Othello's presentation and characterization and the trajectories across the play and this context and its influence. Bye for now.
Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, like the video, click subscribe below and comment anything you'd like to see next. Bye for now.